Hello, my name is Raoul, and the truth is, I don't know who else to tell what happened to me because no one seems to believe me. My family says it was just a strange dream that I've become obsessed with, but I don't believe that's the case. It all started years ago when I was a child and my parents bought a beautiful farm outside of Lexington, Kentucky. The farm was really lovely, had a very cozy atmosphere, and was surrounded by huge green fields where I could play all day. I was very excited to be there. My three siblings and I were looking forward to spending our summer vacations there, and we were not disappointed. You could enjoy nature without any problems, and if you got bored, there was internet. The phones and electricity always worked. It was like having the best of both worlds, the comfort of the city and the beauty and tranquility of country life. Plus, we quickly made friends with the neighborhood kids. The days there were pure joy, and we spent hours exploring every corner of the house and playing in the pastures. But little by little, I began to notice strange things. They were small details that the adults didn't seem to see, but my curious child's eyes recognized them. Once, I was in the house's basement, which my parents had converted into a game room, playing field hockey with some other kids from a nearby farm. Suddenly, we heard voices. They sounded like whispers, like people talking very quietly to each other. At first, we thought it was my siblings playing a trick on us, so we decided to ignore it so they would get bored. But no matter how much we pretended nothing was happening, the whispering didn't stop until it eventually became so creepy that we left the basement and played frisbee in the backyard. Another time, it was raining and I couldn't go outside, so I was assembling a dinosaur model. Suddenly, someone was knocking very persistently on my bedroom door. Thinking it was my parents or one of my siblings, I told them to come in, but the knocking didn't stop. This happened 3 times before I got tired, got up, and opened the door. I remember seeing the shadow of feet on the other side, but when I opened the door, no one was there, not even in the hallway. That was strange enough, but then something even scarier happened. My model flew across the room by itself and crashed against the wall right next to my head. This time, I was so terrified that I ran to my parents, but even though they comforted me and listened to my story, they said it was just my imagination and that the house was a safe and cozy place. But I felt like there was something else, something hiding in the shadows, patiently waiting to attack me. I could feel it. Another time, I remember my siblings and I had worked for hours on what we called the perfect fort. We had used all the cushions from the living room and the blankets from our bedrooms to build an impregnable war fortress, at least in our view. It looked really impressive, and we decided to sleep in it that night. We planned to make popcorn and ice cream in the kitchen to watch movies until we fell asleep. Since I was the youngest, it was my job to bring the items from the kitchen to the fort. But just as I was about to lift the blanket to go inside, I heard a strange whispering that I couldn't understand. It was coming from inside the fort. I was sure it couldn't be any of my brothers, as I had just seen them in the kitchen, and there was only one exit through which I would have seen them leave. I put the 2 bowls of popcorn on the sofa and called out to my brothers, but all I heard were more eerie whispers. I thought maybe one of them had a tablet playing a horror video, and I felt a little silly for being so scared. With a little more confidence, I lifted the blanket, but I don't know how to explain it. Inside, it was as dark as a cave. Forts are usually a bit dark, but when the light is on, the blankets can't block it out completely. But in this case, it was different, as if something inside was swallowing the light. Furthermore, it was strangely cold, much colder than outside. There I stood, facing a fort as dark as a cave and just as cold. Nothing was visible, as if it were a black hole. I was about to call my brothers to show them, but before I could, the fort suddenly collapsed out of nowhere, as if a bomb had exploded inside. The sofas and blankets flew everywhere, the popcorn made a huge mess, and the TV shook so violently that I thought it would fall over. I was completely shocked, trembling with fear and utterly confused. My siblings were incredibly angry with me, thinking I had done it on purpose to annoy them, but of course I hadn't. Although I tried 1,000 times to explain what had happened, they didn't believe me. In the end, everything was ruined and we went to sleep. Such things happened to me every time we went to that farm, but the strangest and most frightening thing for me was that no one else in my family experienced such things. It seemed as if whatever was in that house had fixated on me, as if it were focused on bothering me and ruining my summer vacations. Over time, my visits to the farm became less frequent. As I grew older and had more responsibilities, as well as the general course of life, I was able to stay away from this disturbing place. The mere memory of it made my hair stand on end, but because no one had ever believed me. The day came when my parents decided I had to spend a few days of my vacation there. Initially, everything seemed normal, so much so that I began to think that perhaps everything I had experienced as a child was just my imagination. For a moment, I thought my childish mind had exaggerated things, and maybe nothing unusual had happened in that house. But this calm only lasted until the first night. We had arrived in the morning and had a completely normal day of horseback riding and outdoor activities. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I felt a strange tension in my room. I looked at the door and saw it was open, even though I was sure I had closed it. The hallway seemed darker than usual, and a painting on the wall seemed to be staring at me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination, a remnant of the nightmare from my childhood. So I got back into bed, closed my eyes, and tried to relax. But the feeling of unease just wouldn't go away. Suddenly, I felt the temperature in the room drop as if I were in a freezer. My skin prickled and a shiver ran down my spine. Then I felt something ice cold on my chin, and at that moment I froze and opened my eyes. It was very dark, but in the midst of that darkness, I discerned a shadowy figure hovering directly above me. To my horror, I couldn't make out its face. It was just a dark, human-shaped shadow that sent a wave of pure terror through my bones. I wanted to scream, but no sound came from my throat. My voice was stuck. I wanted to move, but my body was paralyzed, completely immobile. It was as if this being had completely immobilized me, and no matter how hard I tried to scream or move away, my body wouldn't react. The figure began to move, coming closer to my face, and its icy breath grazed my skin. I was still unable to move. Then I felt it lean toward my ear, and I heard a hoarse whisper that will remain in my memory forever. "I'll come back for you someday." At that moment, my panic reached a level I cannot even describe. I have never felt such fear in my entire life. Desperate and completely terrified, I tried one last time to move or scream, and after a few seconds, I managed to let out a faint cry, but it sounded more like a moan, and my movements were spastic rather than controlled. I lay trembling on my bed, my heart beating so fast I thought it would jump out of my chest. Then I heard a faint, malevolent laugh, and the next moment the figure vanished. At the same instant, the room brightened again, and the heavy burden that had just been pressing down on my body suddenly lifted. A few minutes passed before I regained control of my body. I can hardly describe the extent of my fear. My legs were shaking, my breathing was shallow and irregular, and I lay motionless in bed, trying to process what had just happened. A flood of questions ran through my mind. Who was this terrifying figure that had managed to enter my dream and deliver such a threatening message? Why had it chosen me? What did it want from me? I couldn't sleep a wink that night. Instead, I sat in the living room and stayed there until dawn, praying that this being wouldn't reappear. The next morning, I told my parents that I didn't want to stay on the farm any longer. Although I tried to explain to them what had happened, they just said I was too old to be making up such stories. So I didn't insist further because I knew they would never understand. instead. I made up an excuse. I claimed I had an important college project that I needed to complete in the city. I drove back that same day and spent the rest of my vacation at our city house. Since then, I've decided never to return to that cursed place, and to this day, I have kept my word. However, this year, my parents decided to take one of my nephews to the farm for the holidays. They had to return earlier than planned because the boy kept talking about a shadow man following him everywhere. My parents and siblings blame me, claiming I told the little boy stories, but I didn't. I barely exchanged more than a few greetings or short games with him. Besides, he's only 4 years old. I would never scare him with something like that. But I don't think my family will ever believe me. Honestly, I don't care anymore. I don't want to know what this thing is or why it seems so obsessed with me, and now with my nephew too. All I want is for someone to believe me. That would make me feel a little less alone. Unfortunately, I won't find such support in my family. Therefore, I have no choice but to continue staying away from that cursed farm. When I was a little girl, I lived on a farm with my grandmother, Irma, who had the strange habit of constantly saying proverbs. One of them remained in my memory forever. Whenever something was very old, she would say it was older than Uncle Fernando's soul. Once, I asked her about a painting hanging in the living room that showed some green hills and a small yellow house in the middle with colorful flowers. At that moment, my grandmother replied that this painting was older than Uncle Fernando's soul. I found it very funny at the time. It was a cute way to say that something had a lot of history, but over time, I started to wonder who this Uncle Fernando actually was. One day, I went to my mother and asked her to tell me about him. She smiled and suggested that I ask my grandmother to tell me the story of Fernando's soul, as she knew it much better. I was only 8 years old and loved listening to my grandmother's stories. I was especially excited about this one. That afternoon, I ran from the kitchen where my mother was and rushed into my grandmother's room. As soon as I opened the door, I said, "Grandma, tell me the story of Uncle Fernando's soul." She was a little surprised because I burst in and caught her off guard, but then she smiled and motioned for me to sit beside her. My grandmother began to tell me that Uncle Fernando was actually her younger brother. According to her, he was born with his eyes already open, was hairy, and almost never cried. When he was hungry, he moved his arms and mouth as if trying to speak to his mother, but he didn't make a sound. Initially, the family found these things funny. They saw it as part of his personality. But as he got older, everyone noticed that Fernando exhibited quite strange behavior for his age. She remembered a moment when he was about 4 years old and she was 9. They were in the living room, and suddenly he stared out the window very seriously, as if looking at the sky. She recalled that it was raining that day, and while she was trying to figure out what her brother was looking at so intently, Fernando suddenly said that his soul was completely different from theirs because he had an old soul. My grandmother was speechless for a moment and then burst into laughter, thinking it was a joke from him. But he looked at her with a seriousness that surprised her and asked her to stop laughing. But she continued to laugh until she realized that despite her laughter, he remained very serious. So she stopped, and to her surprise, Fernando smiled at her and said that her soul was not yet ready to understand what he meant. A few days later, Fernando told his siblings what he had said, and everyone started to distance themselves from him because it was strange and uncomfortable for them to hear such a young boy talk like that. But my grandmother felt a special affection for Fernando and decided to ignore the others' comments and pay serious attention to what the boy was saying. One evening during dinner, he went to his mother and told her with tears in his eyes that he wanted to go home. Of course, she was confused and replied that they were already home, but the boy insisted, mentioning that he wanted to return to another house, even if she wasn't there. Since they were used to Fernando's strange remarks, his mother decided to ask him more about this house he had in mind. So he began to describe it. It had 2 floors and 3 rooms with wooden frames on the windows. The walls were made of red bricks and covered with small green vines. He also mentioned that the roof was made of wood, that there were roses at the entrance that filled the house with fragrance upon entering, and that when it rained a lot, water leaked through the kitchen ceiling. His mother was shocked by this detailed description because they had never visited such a place. She tried to explain to her son that she couldn't know this house because they had always lived in this old farmhouse where they currently were. But at that moment, Fernando said that she hadn't lived in this time, that he had been there before everything was flooded and the earth had taken him back. This confused her even more. She didn't understand what her son was talking about, and in the end, she just smiled, patted his head a few times, and told him he had a great imagination. My grandmother said she was fascinated by Fernando's description of the house, but the rest of his siblings were scared every time he mentioned the place again. When Fernando was almost 7 years old, my grandmother noticed something in the newspaper that caught her attention. Her father bought it on Sundays because they didn't have a TV on the farm, and on one of the pages, there was a note about a ghost town, a place near the sea that had been flooded many years ago. It said that no one had lived there for more than 30 years, and that the houses were being rebuilt to turn it into a tourist destination. The report was detailed and included several photos of the houses that had been part of the town before the flood that destroyed the place. As she looked at the pictures, one of them particularly caught my grandmother's eye. It was a house that perfectly matched her brother's description: brick walls, a wooden roof, roses at the entrance, and vines climbing the walls. If it wasn't the same, it looked far too similar to the house Fernando was talking about. So she ran to show him the picture, but when he saw it, he said he wasn't entirely sure. He didn't seem to remember what he had said years earlier, although he was impressed that his sister had remembered his description so accurately. She urged her parents to visit this place, believing that, even though he couldn't remember it precisely, he had lived there in a previous life, and for some strange reason, had memories of that past existence. Of course, that sounded crazy to his parents. My grandmother said that her father punished her that day harder than ever before, and never again afterward. Her father was a man of deep Christian faith, and what she was saying sounded like blasphemy to him. After this incident, my grandmother and Fernando decided not to talk about these topics in front of the family anymore. And the truth was that it wasn't a big problem because over time their older siblings moved out. Some went to the city, others started their own families. Since my grandmother and Fernando were the youngest, they were the last to leave the house. Over time, he seemed to have forgotten everything he had told as a child. Fernando was always a quiet person. He liked to spend time alone in nature. And sometimes he would go into the forest at night and not return until the next day. He said he slept wherever the night surprised him, and he was always kind to everyone who knew him. However, my grandmother still clearly remembered the stories he had told her as a child, and so she always reminded him that he had an old soul. When she had her first child, she immediately said that some things were older than Fernando's soul. And this phrase quickly became one of her typical sayings. However, I had never met Uncle Fernando, so I asked my grandmother what had become of him. With a sad expression, she told me that once, when my mother was still a little girl, he said they had to say goodbye. She didn't quite understand what was going on at the time, but he insisted that he had to leave and couldn't return, even though he knew they would meet again in another place. From that day on, she never saw her brother again. He had gone into the mountains and never returned. My grandmother always told my mother about him, and later, when I was born, she shared the whole story with me too. The truth is, I didn't think much about Uncle Fernando until a few years ago when my grandmother became ill. They say that when older people are about to leave this world, they begin to release their minds piece by piece. It's as if they sense they have to say goodbye and start seeing things we can't perceive, and that's exactly what happened with my grandmother. 3 years ago, her health deteriorated, and she spent more time in bed. During this phase, she began to say that her time here would soon be over. We were very sad to hear this, but there was something reassuring, almost comforting in her tone. One night, I couldn't sleep because my throat was dry. So I decided to get up and go to the kitchen to get a glass of water. I didn't turn on any lights because I didn't want to disturb anyone. While I was in the kitchen, I thought I heard my grandmother's voice, so I slowly approached her room, whose door she always left slightly ajar. I peeked in and saw her looking at a chair next to her bed and smiling. She seemed to be talking to someone, but I couldn't understand what she was saying. It was just whispers. I strained to see better, and in the light filtering through the window, I could swear that something or someone was sitting on that chair. It wasn't a shadow, but a violet, glowing silhouette that emitted light and seemed to hover. At that moment, I held my breath. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Then the lamp suddenly turned on and the silhouette disappeared. I quickly turned around to look at my grandmother. She had turned on the light of her bedside lamp. She called out to me and asked if I had been there long. I didn't know how to answer her, but I noticed she had tears in her eyes, so I told her what I had seen. She smiled and said that her brother had visited her. It was the second time in a few days that he had visited her. I asked her which brother she was talking about, even though I already knew the answer. She didn't say anything more, but she looked calm and almost happy. She told me that Fernando was waiting for her and that it would soon be time to see him again. That night, I cried with my grandmother because I knew what her words meant, so I slept next to her, hugging her tightly to prevent her from going anywhere, but at dawn she was already gone. I woke up, still embracing her fragile body, but soon realized that her soul was no longer there. She had left with Uncle Fernando. This experience spans from my mother's childhood to my early teenage years. I have always been deeply interested in the paranormal, as far back as I can remember. This is because my earliest memories are marked by the paranormal. I spent most of my childhood on a 100-year-old family farm in a rural area in southwest Georgia. This farm belonged to my maternal grandmother's family. We lived in a 3-room trailer right off the road that ran through the farm. About 30 minutes further was my grandfather's family farm, where my mother grew up. I'll start with my earliest memories. I can't say exactly when it began or how, but it was always after my parents had put me to bed and left the room. I would be lying in a standard bed, looking at the door. I always slept with the door open and the closet and hallway lights on. I wouldn't let them go until the lights were on because I knew what was coming. I could never bring myself to ask them to close the door, and I don't think I'll ever know exactly why. As soon as they left, I would close my eyes, open them again, and I would be paralyzed. I would stare down the hall at the bathroom door. As soon as I blinked, I would see the first strange resident of the hall playing its tricks, a shadow man, or as most know him, the Hat Man. He was about 6'3" tall, wore a large hat like Abraham Lincoln's but a little shorter, and a long trench coat. I could never make out any real facial features. He was just a silhouette. He would appear and walk down the hall toward my brother's room, and that was it. We'll come back to this guy later because he plays a more important role, so remember his name, Thomas. I would blink, and the next apparition would appear. This one still makes my heart pound with fear today. I tried to tell myself it was a protector. My young brain even thought it might be a weird-looking angel. I couldn't imagine any other positive reason why it should just stand in my doorway and stare at me for God knows how long. Believe me, I always tried to find something positive about it. It wasn't human. even though it stood like one. It had the face and features of a dingo or dog, maybe even a deer. Its body was covered in short, light brown fur. It had long arms that hung down to its hips, and its paws looked like hands but were still paw-like with claws. It also had very long legs, small, black, glittering eyes, and a long snout with one small, sharp tooth on each side. The large, pointed ears were only a few inches from the doorframe. It had a large, shiny black nose, and I don't know if I imagined it, but a luminous white aura seemed to hover around its head. It just stood there, staring at me seemingly forever, with no expression or emotion whatsoever, just those black, almond-shaped eyes. All I could do was stare back, unable to move and just waiting in fear. Finally, I would blink and it was gone. For years, I wondered what it could have been. When I was younger, I pursued the idea that it was a Native American spirit. We occasionally found arrowheads on the farm, so I knew Native Americans had been there once. Later, I thought maybe it was a totem animal standing guard. Later, I even came up with the idea that it might be Anubis himself, but as far as I know, I have no connection to Egyptian culture or heritage. To this day, I have never seen a picture or description of anything similar to it. The next apparition I remember was nothing more than the silhouette of a gorilla scurrying down the hall. Simple and crazy, I know. I started seeing it after picking up a small elephant statue that lay under one of the old, long-destroyed servant houses. On the bottom, it simply said, "Made in Asia." I think I still have it somewhere at home. The gorilla didn't scare me too much, at least not until I had a dream one night, or maybe it was a nightmare. I'm sure in this dream the silhouettes multiplied, but this time they had glowing red eyes. They chased me all over the house, and it ended with Thomas, now armed with a sword, cutting them to pieces and protecting me. I was in a panic until he showed up, and that was it. In retrospect, it seems a little silly, but it only confirmed my and my mother's view of Thomas. Those were the only apparitions I remember. It all stopped around the time I turned 6. I finally told my mother about it, and she encouraged me to tell my teacher. I don't know why, but not long after that, it stopped completely. However, bedtime was still a nightmare after all that. I constantly had nightmares and was terribly afraid of any movement or of someone going outside at night. The hallway light always stayed on in case the visitors came back. I wanted to be able to see them and know where they were. Later, my mother told me her own story. This is where we come back to Thomas. I wasn't the first to see him. She told me that she had seen him when she was a child, in a similar way to me. One day, he came to her in a dream. He told her his name was Thomas and that he was a friend. After that, he left through the window. She didn't see him again during her teenage and adult years, at least not until she had me. When I was a baby, she would sometimes hold me, and I would giggle and babble at something behind her. Then, the lights would start to flicker. Occasionally, she would see Thomas out of the corner of her eye. My paternal grandmother also observed me talking to something in the corner of her house. This was on a completely different property that had its own ghost stories. My friend, who had never experienced anything of the sort before, saw a shadow man standing at the foot of the bed last summer when we stayed there. My mother and I have always wondered where he might have come from. We thought maybe he came from a table she had in her old house that we put away when I was about 6. Or perhaps he came from the old family cemetery that lies just down the dusty road in the woods. This cemetery always felt like a safe place, but I always felt like something evil was watching me from the woods there. I never stayed outside very long at night and never opened the blinds at night for fear that something might be staring back. My mother and I agreed that Thomas was probably some kind of protector. After that, I didn't really see Thomas anymore. Occasionally, I would see a shadow out of the corner of my eye, and sometimes I would hear someone call my name, only to turn around and find no one there. I didn't have another encounter with him until much later. I had made the mistake of putting a mirror in my closet. If you don't know, it is said that a mirror in a closet can open a portal and let things in. That's when I started seeing a puddle on my bedroom ceiling. My brother saw a girl who looked exactly like me walk past his room while I was downstairs. My stepfather also saw Thomas. He described the exact silhouette I knew, including the shorter top hat, a detail I usually don't mention when telling the story, and the way he held himself when he walked. I haven't had any encounters with any of my childhood ghosts since my mother cleaned the apartment, but now I'm just waiting to see if they might reappear someday when I have my own daughter. I will pass on my story along with my mother's to her, but maybe nothing will happen at all. Perhaps it all has to do only with these old properties. Everyone from rural South Georgia will tell you how haunted many of the areas there are. Between these Civil War towns and the old farms like mine, there are countless old stories. I lived about 30 minutes to an hour away from Andersonville, the old prison camp for Union soldiers. There were many reports of sightings of dead soldiers there. Now I am stationed far, far away from there in California. I still own the property where I grew up. Neither of my parents wanted to stay there after they got divorced and my grandfather died. He left it to me and my brother. It is now overgrown and unused. I still visit it when I'm on leave. But you won't catch me there alone at night. Many people have told me that it was all just sleep paralysis, but that doesn't explain my mother's experiences or the other encounters I had. I simply cannot be satisfied with that explanation. Today, because of all these experiences, I have a great interest and deep respect for the paranormal. I grew up on a cattle farm in rural Oklahoma, about an hour from Tulsa. It was just me, my parents, and my older sister, Jenny. Our nearest neighbors lived about a mile down the road, and the nearest town was a good half-hour away. It was the kind of place where you could walk for hours without seeing another soul. Don't get me wrong, it was a good childhood in many ways. Plenty of room to run around and always work to do on the farm. But there was a certain loneliness, plenty of time for the imagination of a country boy. At least, that's what I told myself to explain all the things I saw and experienced. It started when I was about 7 years old. I remember it because it was right after my birthday. I had gotten a new telescope and was completely obsessed with stargazing. One night, I was standing in the field behind our house, looking at the sky, when I saw something strange. It wasn't a star, nor was it a plane. It was a light that moved in an impossible way, zigzagging across the sky, stopping on a dime, and then disappearing in another direction. I called my father, but by the time he got to me, it was gone. He patted my head and said it was probably a satellite, but even then I knew that couldn't be right. Satellites just don't move like that. That was just the beginning. Over the next few years, strange things kept happening. At first, just minor things that were easy to dismiss or explain away, like the time I found weird tracks in the mud near the pond. They had 3 toes, almost like a bird's, but bigger and deeper. My father said it must have been a heron, but I had seen herons before, and these tracks were different. Then there were the noises. Sometimes I would wake up at night and hear a deep, low humming sound. It wasn't loud, more like a vibration you could feel in your chest. I asked Jenny if she heard or felt it too, and she said yes, but our parents never seemed to notice it. The really strange things always happened when I was alone. I remember one afternoon when I was about 9. I was out checking the fence, something I often did to help my father. It was a hot day, the sun was blazing, not a cloud in the sky. I was walking along the edge of the property where our land bordered the woods when suddenly, everything went silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. The air felt heavy, like just before a thunderstorm. That's when I saw it, just for a second, mind you, in the shadows between the trees. It was tall, maybe 7 feet high and thin. Its skin looked rough, almost scaly, and its eyes were huge and black like a beetle's. I blinked and it was gone. The sounds of the farm came rushing back at once. The crickets chirped frantically, the birds called to each other, and I could even hear the distant lowing of the cattle. I ran all the way back to the house, but this time I didn't tell my father or anyone else. They hadn't believed me then, and they wouldn't believe me now. Another time, when I was 10, I was in the barn late at night, helping my father with the birth of a calf. My father had gone back to the house to get a few more things, leaving me alone to watch. I was sitting on a hay bale, trying not to fall asleep, when I heard a scratching sound from the hayloft above me. I looked up, and there was a face peering out between the slats. It wasn't human. The head was too large, too angular, and the eyes were the same black, shiny ones as in the woods that time. I could also see a clawed hand gripping one of the boards. I must have made some noise because my father came rushing into the barn, but by the time he got there, whatever I had seen was gone. My father ran up the ladder to the hayloft to check, but he found nothing. No traces, not even footprints in the dust. These incidents continued over the years. Sometimes it was just a feeling, the certainty that something was watching me, just outside my field of vision. Other times it was more concrete, strange lights in the sky moving in ways that planes and helicopters simply can't, or odd scorch marks in the fields that seem to appear overnight. One of the most vivid memories I have is from when I was 11 years old. I had gone fishing in our pond, about half a mile from the house. I must have fallen asleep in the warm afternoon sun because the next thing I knew it was already dusk. As I was packing my things, I saw ripples on the surface of the pond. Something was moving under the water, and whatever it was big. I thought it might be a snapping turtle. We had some real monsters in that pond. But then, it surfaced for a brief moment. It wasn't a turtle. It was nothing I had ever seen before. Its skin was just as scaly as the thing I had seen in the woods. It had a long neck and those eyes, those terrifying black, shiny eyes. I dropped everything I was holding and ran. When I finally made it back to the house, my mother was frantic. Apparently, I had been gone much longer than I thought. It seemed to me as if I had only been at the pond for about 2 hours. But according to my family, I had been gone since the morning, almost 8 hours. The strangest thing was that I had a small, perfectly round mark on my neck that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a cut or a bruise. It was more like a slightly raised scar. After a few weeks, it disappeared again, but sometimes when I'm alone and it's quiet, I swear I can still feel it. As I got older, I started doing research to understand all these experiences. I read about UFO sightings and alien encounters. Some of these reports matched my experiences frighteningly well. Did you know that people have been reporting reptilian-like beings for decades, and the time lost at the pond? That's a classic symptom of alien abduction. But you know what? I'm not saying I was abducted by aliens. I'm not even saying I believe in aliens, not really. All I know is that for a few years in my childhood, the world felt stranger and scarier than it should have been. The experiences subsided as I got older. By the time I was in high school, they stopped completely. I was relieved, partly at least. But another part of me, and this sounds crazy, another part missed it. As terrifying as it was also fascinating. It made the world, or rather the universe, seem bigger and more mysterious. Then again, maybe it was just my overactive imagination combined with the loneliness on the farm. Who knows? Maybe I had some undiagnosed illness that caused hallucinations. Damn, maybe there was even a gas leak somewhere in the ground, but I don't think that's true. I am now 35 years old, have my own family, and live in the suburbs of Tulsa, about an hour from my parents' farm. I have a normal job and a normal life. Sometimes, especially when I visit my parents, all the old feelings come back. Last summer, I took my own children to the farm for a week. One night, my 8-year-old son ran into the house, his eyes wide with excitement. He said he saw lights dancing in the sky, moving in a strange way. My heart almost stopped. I went outside with him, but of course, there was nothing left to see, just the stars and the blinking lights of distant airplanes. I pointed at the planes and told him that was probably all it was. But immediately, I was overcome with a bad conscience. It was as if I was the biggest hypocrite. Wasn't I doing exactly what my parents had done to me back then? Just dismiss something because it doesn't fit into our ordered worldview. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, I walked out to the old pond. I stood there in the dark, listening to the chorus of frogs and crickets. For a moment, I felt like the scared, confused child I once was again. I don't know what I expected. Maybe I had gone back there looking for a sign, any confirmation that my memories were real, but there was nothing. Nothing was waiting for me, just a quiet night. But as I turned to go back, I suddenly felt a tingling on the back of my neck. It was that familiar feeling of being watched. My heart started beating faster. I turned around quickly and looked at the pond, and I swear I saw a single ripple on the water's surface. I immediately ran back to the house. I locked the doors, checked on the children, and tried to convince myself that it was nothing. But I wouldn't be honest if I said I slept well that night. I just couldn't shake the feeling that maybe something was out there that still remembered me. I was staying overnight at one of my cousin's houses. I'll call him Charlie, along with all my other cousins. I should clarify that we aren't biologically related, but we were very close, just like our parents. It just felt like we were a real family. We were divided into boys and girls, 11 of us in total, 6 boys and 5 girls. Yeah, I don't know how our parents managed that. Luckily, we were on a farm with a few acres of land around the house. The boys took the sunroom at the front of the house, while us girls got the playroom at the back of the house. The boys had the sunroom because it was bigger and they were the majority. The playroom where we slept had a door that led out into the garden, where we played games, swung on the swings, and jumped on the trampoline. We spent hours out there. Beyond the 300-meter strip that we called our garden was a small patch of dense forest. On the other side of that was Charlie's neighbor's house. Charlie's neighbor was a strange old man, estimated to be in his late 40s or early 50s. He was always randomly in the woods between the 2 houses whenever we kids were outside playing on the trampoline or in the garden near the woods. The worst part was that he always talked to us, especially the younger girls. He would say things like, "Hello, ladies, is your father home? And do you want to come over to my place? I baked some cookies you could try." Every time we just replied no and went back inside. Charlie's mother and father had told us not to listen to him. If he came onto our property, we should go get one of the adults. Charlie's father had warned him a few times, and once he even came out armed because the man had become aggressive. Charlie's mother said we could also go to her if he tried anything, but we all knew she was just as scared as we were. He constantly harassed her, especially when she was outside hanging laundry or feeding the dogs. In the evenings, it got even worse for her. Things like, "Is your husband home? When was the last time you were satisfied? Why don't you come over to my house later?" She would reply softly every time and just go inside like we did. Another time, when we were all staying over at Charlie's, we saw his mother come in and call Charlie's father into the bedroom. Most of us kids tried to listen to what was happening on the other side of the door. We heard muffled whispering and crying. Charlie's father then left the house with a gun and went outside. It turned out that the creepy man had said something terrible to the mother, something we kids never found out. We only know that it had something to do with killing all of us except Charlie's mother, whom he wanted to kidnap to do God knows what with her. We tried to get the police involved, but they only gave him a verbal warning and said they couldn't do much because there was a lack of evidence. Now back to what I experienced myself. We were playing on the trampoline after a nerve-wracking session when we heard a rustling in the bushes. We all went silent. My little cousin clung to me. I asked what was that, hoping we would see a few deer or maybe a coyote. I used to live in Australia, so I was quite excited to see a normal American one. Charlie hissed at me to be quiet and said that it probably wasn't that. It was already dusk, and I was sugar high and surrounded by my cousins. As one of the oldest, I felt a little too brave. "Who's out there?" I yelled, my voice echoing in the air. No answer. "Come on, show yourself," shouted Gabes, one of the boys who was the bravest of us. One of the girls loudly suggested that we go back inside and see after dinner. The other kids went inside, except for Charlie, Felix, one of the boys, Gabes, and me. Like my father, I was very territorial and wanted to protect my cousins. We waited for a while, but nothing happened. No more rustling, nothing. The rest of us got bored, so we all went back into the house. Charlie and I were closest to the woods. I was talking to her when we both heard a voice quietly whisper, "Not quietly enough, Charlie." We both turned around, white as a sheet with fear. Then we heard a whistling, a slow, bird-like whistling. We ran into the house. We didn't tell Gabes and Felix what we had heard. Later that night, we were back in our makeshift bedrooms. We 5 girls started watching a movie. I don't remember exactly what movie it was, but it was definitely one of those romantic teen movies. I don't want to sound like the edgy person, but I hate romances. I even felt a little uneasy in my stomach after the movie. If you like it, that's perfectly fine, you do you, but I didn't want to watch it. Instead, I just sat there and looked out the open window. I thought the neighbor might be looking for a lost dog in the woods or something, but I kept seeing flashes of light. By the end of the movie, most of the girls were asleep except for Charlie and me. We were talking about school, boys, and our problems with bullies when I suddenly saw the shadow of a man in the background near the trampoline. Charlie and I both immediately shot up. "Could that be your dad?" I asked. "No," she replied. "He's too short. Besides, you can hear my dad snoring." In the silent night, we could actually hear the faint sounds of the TV, occasional laughter from the boys, and her father's loud snoring. Then, through the open window, we heard it again, that whistling. Charlie and I thought that maybe one of the boys was trying to scare us, so we went to their room to tell them to stop. When we got there, all the boys were sitting in front of the TV, watching a soccer game. They looked at us in surprise when we came in, so we just turned around wordlessly and went back. When we got back to our room, we saw him, Charlie's creepy neighbor, standing at the window, making that terrible whistling sound. "Hello, ladies." He grinned while holding something in his hand that looked like a utility knife. He was trying to cut open the screen with the blade. Charlie screamed so loudly that I didn't think a human could even do that. Everyone in the room woke up. The boys stormed into our room, followed by Charlie's mother and father. Charlie's father ran outside to chase him, while her mother called the police. About 10 minutes later, Charlie's father came back. He had found duct tape, a rope, some kind of whip, and a lighter in the exact bush where we had heard the rustling earlier. God only knows what he had planned that night and with whom. The man was found, arrested, and eventually convicted, but I don't know how long he will stay in prison. Hopefully, for the rest of his life. I never want to see him again. I used to own and operate a dairy farm about an hour outside of Milwaukee. I ran it for almost 20 years before the economy took a downturn and I had to close it. Nowadays, I live in the city, working a pretty normal 9-to-5 job until it's time for retirement. But I can't say I particularly miss the farm, not after what happened. The incident occurred about 12 years ago. I had a small workforce that helped me run the operation, mostly local youths and a few long-time employees. But we needed someone to take care of the landscaping and keep everything looking tidy. You see, we sometimes had tours, school groups, and the like. Sometimes they were free, sometimes they paid, which was a little extra income and good for community relations. So I placed an ad in the local newspaper, and that's how I met a man named McAfee. He seemed nice at first, a quiet guy, maybe in his late 30s. He said he had recently moved to the area, had some gardening experience, and was willing to work for a decent wage. So I hired him. McAfee's main job was to keep the areas around the farmhouse and the tour routes clean, but he had a particular interest in the pond we had a little ways from the main house. He said he wanted to create a real attraction there, something that would excite visitors. I figured it couldn't hurt, so I let him go ahead. I remember one occasion when I went to see how he was progressing at the pond. He was planting new flowers, and I made some remark about how beautiful they looked. He turned to me with that strange smile and said, "Beauty is only skin deep, sir. It's what lies beneath that matters." That might not sound particularly strange by itself, but it was the way he said it. His eyes had that intense look, as if he wanted to tell me something without actually saying it. It gave me goosebumps. Another time, I overheard him talking to one of the students who worked part-time for us. McAfee was saying that plants grow better when they have something to feed on. He said he had a special fertilizer that he made himself. The way he talked about it, almost with enthusiasm, made my blood run cold. However, the incident that really stuck in my mind happened about 6 months after McAfee started working for us. I was walking past the equipment shed late one evening when I heard a noise from inside. At that time, all the other workers had gone home hours ago, so I was curious. I peeked in and there was McAfee. He had one of our large hunting knives and was just staring at it while running his finger along the blade. He didn't notice me at first, and the expression on his face, I can't even properly describe it. It was like a mixture of fascination and hunger. When he finally looked up, he flinched as if he had been caught red-handed. He mumbled something about checking the tools and hurried past me. I stood there for at least 5 minutes after he left, trying to shake off the cold feeling that had come over me. After that, I started watching McAfee more closely. Nothing obvious, you understand. I didn't want to accuse him of doing something he hadn't done, but I kept an eye on him. I noticed that he sometimes came to work with scratches on his arms or dirt under his fingernails, even early in the morning. Once, I could have sworn I saw blood on his sleeve, but when I looked again, it was gone. About a year after I hired McAfee, he suddenly disappeared. He just didn't show up for work one day and didn't call. His phone was also turned off. I drove to the address he had given me when I hired him, but the person living there said they had never heard of McAfee. I was worried, of course, but also a little relieved. Something about McAfee had always made me nervous, and now he was gone. I thought that was the end of the story, but it wasn't, not by a long shot. It was almost exactly a year after McAfee disappeared that things got truly terrible. I was down by the pond, the one McAfee had spent so much time at. It had become quite overgrown since he left, and I hadn't hired anyone to take care of it. There was this one spot near the water that was growing like crazy. The plants there were enormous, much bigger than I would have expected, and the colors were just wrong, too vibrant, almost garish. I remembered what McAfee had said about his special fertilizer, and a shiver ran down my spine. I don't know what prompted me to dig. Curiosity, a grim hunch, whatever it was. I wish I had ignored it and let someone else do the digging, because what I found, I still have nightmares about it. About 1.5 feet under the ground, I hit something solid. At first, I thought it was a root or maybe an old piece of equipment buried there. But as I shoveled away more dirt, I realized I had hit a human skull. I'd like to say I kept my composure and immediately called the police, but honestly, I panicked. I stumbled backward, fell onto my and just sat there staring at the partially exposed skull for minutes. When I finally regained my composure, I called the sheriff. They came with a forensics team and started digging further. They found 2 bodies buried there, both women. The medical examiner estimated they had been there for about 2 years. The investigation that followed was a nightmare. Cops swarmed everywhere on my farm. Reporters sniffed around for a story. They questioned me, of course, but I think they quickly realized I wasn't involved. I told them about McAfee, gave them all the information I had about the guy, but it wasn't much. They never found him. From what the detectives told me, they believe he was responsible for at least 5 murders in 3 different states. Always the same procedure. Women in their 20s or 30s, buried in rural areas, often near bodies of water. They believe he traveled a lot, taking jobs on farms or in parks where he could work alone and have access to remote locations. The worst part, one of the detectives hinted that they had found traces of a chemical substance in the soil around the bodies. He wouldn't give me details, but from the look on his face, I could tell it was something sinister. All I could think of was McAfee talking about his special fertilizer and how well plants grew when they had something to feed on. As I said, the economy went into a downward spiral, and this situation didn't exactly help. I sold the farm and moved to the city. I just couldn't bear to be out there anymore, knowing what had happened, knowing that I had employed a murderer, that I had held perfectly normal conversations with him while God, I can't even imagine what was going through his head. I sometimes wonder, did he kill those people right there on my property, or did he just bring them there? I live in Central Texas, and my family and I own a farm. It's about 33 acres. I'm going to give a little background before I get to these 2 experiences. I've always had a pretty vivid imagination, especially when I was about 10 years old. I constantly saw things and had nightmares, which eventually sparked my interest in everything supernatural, aliens, ghosts, just everything. Nevertheless, I believe these experiences were real. In the winter of 2020, possibly 2019, we were doing our evening chores in the darkness, as the sun had set at 6 p.m., and we usually feed our animals around 7 p.m. Our back pasture is home to our horses and cows, to whom I was giving extra hay on this cold evening. As I pushed the wheelbarrow to the gate, I noticed something above the tree line in the back of our pasture. There's a small patch of woods where coyotes and other wildlife live. As I looked at this UFO, I noticed it looked like a flying saucer with lights all around it. I squinted to see it better, but at that moment, it disappeared behind the trees. It was as if it had seen me. I didn't realize back then how far the tree line actually was. I thought it was some fancy drone our rich neighbors had bought. I didn't think any more about it, finished my work, and went to bed. The next morning, while doing my chores, I noticed how far the trees really were. With wide eyes, I mumbled, "That thing was much bigger than I thought." After finishing my work, I went to my mother and little brother to tell them about it. They were confused but believed me. My brother even mentioned it later that evening when we were back with the animals. "Now I'm scared to go down there," he laughed. We never saw that flying saucer again. My second experience happened with my mother about a year later. We were going to check on the chicks and the rabbit hutch. We used our cell phone flashlights, and while we were refilling the food, both lights suddenly went out at the same time. We couldn't turn them back on. Confused, we let our eyes adjust to the dark and continued. The rabbit hutch is near the back pasture with the horses and cows. It used to be a shady shelter for the goats. But since there were enough trees and another small barn, we now used it for the rabbits. The night sky is beautiful in the country, so we looked up to see the stars. But the first thing I saw was a red light floating across the sky. "Oh, a plane," I said, pointing at the light. "Over there by the water tower," my mother asked, pointing in a completely different direction. I looked at her confusedly, but then noticed that there was another red light there. "Oh, 2 planes," I thought, raising my eyebrows. Then I looked in yet another direction and saw a third red light. "That's strange, 3 planes at the same time out here," I wondered. That's when I noticed they formed a huge triangle. Suddenly, my mother's flashlight turned back on. It startled me, but I didn't think much of it. We checked the rabbits and turned off the light. As we walked back to the house, my flashlight also turned back on. I turned it off to save battery and looked up. The three lights were gone. I swallowed and we quickly hurried back to the house. I told my best friend about it, who is also very interested in such things. She texted me in all caps, aliens. I laughed and replied, possible, but I'm not sure. I wasn't lying back then, but now that I've found the Ecast podcasts, I've realized that other UFO sightings were very similar to my experiences. Did I actually see UFOs, or were they drones or planes? Who knows? I think I saw them. My mother thinks the same, and my friends believe it too. But if all these sightings are true, what are these things and what are they doing here? Are they just observing us? That was about a year ago, and it still bothers me today. Either way, it was an eerie and unforgettable experience. I'm not sure I want to experience something like that again. Four years ago, on the 4th of July, I spent a whole week at my grandma's house. It was just me, my grandma, and my cousin there. My cousin and I were rummaging through my deceased grandfather's old belongings and stumbled upon a Ouija board. We were both totally excited to discover it. Our parents were very religious and worried about everything, which is why we had never seen anything like it before. We decided to use it later that night after Grandma had gone to bed. A little background info. My grandma lives on a huge property in Texas with nothing nearby. We were completely alone. My grandparents had bought the land and built a house on it many years ago. The house is very long but no more than a few rooms wide. Of course, my cousin and I, who are the same age, decided to be in the room farthest from Grandma's bedroom, even if we had screamed. She wouldn't have heard us. She said goodnight around 9:30 p.m., and we waited another hour to make sure she was fast asleep. Then we pulled out the board and started asking questions. They were simple questions, and it answered them. However, my cousin got angry when the board moved, thinking I was manipulating it. We started talking angrily to it and making fun of it. That was probably the dumbest idea he could have had. But I made an even bigger mistake. I just packed it up and put it back in the box. It's clear to me now that I should have apologized and properly said goodbye to close any possible pathways. Time passed and nothing happened. I always had to sleep upstairs, right next to the attic, while the rest of my family got the rooms downstairs. It never really bothered me because my sister also slept upstairs. I remember always hearing about unexplained things that had happened there. Once my grandma came home from work and found the house destroyed. It looked like a break-in, but nothing was stolen, and the alarm was strangely still activated when she came in. That was the biggest experience, but there were many small ones, doors closing, knocking on the walls, and all the other clichés. Last summer, I stayed there alone again and slept upstairs. On the first night, I had a severe nightmare. I was lying on my air mattress and heard a loud knocking from the attic. Then it started scratching at the attic door. Finally, the door opened, and I saw a black figure about 5 feet 4 inches tall coming out and just staring at me. The next morning at breakfast, my grandma asked me why I had been scratching at the door last night. My heart almost stopped, and my blood ran cold. A few hours later, I felt like I had to find out if something was wrong. I started a FaceTime call with a friend, took a pool cue, and ripped open the attic door. I walked around but found nothing suspicious. However, in the very back was a small black mass with 2 tiny white dots as eyes. I took a screenshot of my FaceTime call and ran out of the room. While talking to my friend, he suggested checking again to make sure they weren't holes in the roof. I did, and this time the 2 small white dots were gone, and the black mass was gone too. A few weeks later, when I was talking to my grandma, I discovered that her land used to be a cotton farm. The owner back then was very violent towards his slaves. I also learned that the couple who lived there before died unexpectedly on the property and were also buried there. I think that pretty well explains why no one should use a Ouija board. I personally don't believe that Ouija boards actually work. I rather believe that demons notice when people try to mess with things that are too big for them and want to teach them a lesson. I hope this is a sufficient warning for anyone who thinks they can handle the supernatural. You might just end up vanishing without a trace. I was raised on a farm that had avocado trees and wild goats. The farm had a beautiful small pond and many different walking trails. We moved there when I was about 12 years old, and like any other 12-year-old, I loved being outside, but I was afraid of the dark, so I never went out after sunset. By the age of 16, I had gotten used to country life and loved it. My father, who worked from home, noticed this. He gave me more autonomy on the farm, and my chores increased. That would probably have annoyed any other teenager, but as I said, I loved country life. This led to my first encounter with this shadow being. I was picking some avocados for dinner, and I couldn't shake off this strange feeling of being watched. I looked around and noticed a black figure quickly disappearing behind a tree about 20 meters away. That startled me, so I shouted, "Hey, I saw you. You're trespassing on private property, and I'm armed." Of course, I wasn't armed. I only had a pocket knife with me. I added, "I won't hesitate to shoot." I started walking towards the tree, the knife firmly in one hand and the bag of avocados in the other. When I reached the tree and looked behind it, I found nothing. Confused but not overly concerned, I headed back to the house. As I got closer, I heard my mother calling me, asking me to hurry up. I called back that I would be there in a moment. That's an important detail to remember. The rest of the night went completely normally. We had dinner, watched some TV, and went to bed. My room was on the ground floor while my parents' was upstairs. I was asleep until I was suddenly awakened by a knocking on my window, over and over again. I heard someone mumbling something unintelligible before it suddenly stopped. I just went back to sleep and ignored it. The next evening, I got into an argument with my mother. I don't remember what it was about. To calm myself down, I went for a walk. I was walking along a path lined with many trees when I suddenly heard my mother's voice. She asked me where I was and why I was taking so long. It sounded like her, but also somehow like a radio with static noise. Then she called me again, this time asking why I had run away from her. I turned around and saw it, this shadow being with black lines around it, almost like a drawing. Its eyes were deep red, and it had an eerie smile on its lips. It looked at me and said in my mother's voice, "Hello." I was frozen. I couldn't move. I was so scared. It started moving towards me, and I heard a sound like dry leaves being crushed under feet. This sound broke me out of my trance. I turned around and ran. I heard it calling me as I ran. With that demonic and ominous voice, it told me to stop. I reached the house, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My parents were startled, and I told them what had happened. To my surprise, they believed me because of the fear in my eyes, my father said later. Since then, I haven't had any more encounters with this being, or whatever it was. We performed a cleansing ritual for the house and the property afterward, and everything has been fine since. I come from Costa Rica, a small country in Central America. We have several local legends and monsters, including a type of witch or devil woman who steals the hides of animals to use them and gain their abilities. The catch is that, similar to a skinwalker, she might end up looking wrong and deformed. When I was 14, we lived on a farm. My grandparents from the USA also liked it there, so they built a vacation home right next to our house, with the porch separating the two buildings. Since they hardly ever visited, I convinced them to let me have the master bedroom in the vacation home as my own room, as I was the oldest. I've always had trouble sleeping, so it wasn't unusual for me to be awake past midnight. That night, I was alone in the other house. I should mention that it was completely empty except for my room. Since it's a farm, there are trees, of course, but not close enough for anything to jump from the trees onto the roof. And yet, I suddenly heard something land on the roof, right where my parents' bedroom was. A few seconds passed, and then this thing started running, heading straight for my room. The sound was so loud that it felt like the roof was about to collapse at any moment. I couldn't move, and my window was open since it was a cold night. Luckily, it at least had a screen, because as soon as this thing reached my head, it swung onto the screen and clung to it while screaming and trying to get in. I saw it. It looked almost like a monkey, but the face was more cat-like. The hands ended in claws. I panicked, ran, closed the window, and locked it while I could still hear the thing. Then I locked myself in the bathroom and stayed there until morning. When my parents woke up, I asked them if they had heard anything during the night, but they hadn't heard a thing. After that, I went outside to check the screen because I absolutely did not want to open the window. Lo and behold, the screen was almost completely shredded. Of course, I moved my things back into my old room, which I shared with my little sister that day. I got in trouble for the destroyed screen.